My name is Willa Everett, and I was 36 the week I learned what my family thought a funeral was worth. My husband Daniel had been gone 4 days. My entire family skipped his funeral, every single one, to eat cake at my brother's 40th birthday. 3 people signed the guest book. 3. While they were singing Happy Birthday, I was watching a casket lower at 2:14 in the afternoon. They told themselves it was one wasted Saturday. They told themselves Daniel wouldn't know who showed up. 2 weeks later, my lawyer mailed each of them a letter. It opened with 5 words: per the estate of Daniel. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts, and family learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and consequences are your thing, drop a comment and subscribe. Now let me tell you about the afternoon they chose a party over a goodbye. I count things for a living. I'm a forensic accountant, which means I find the lie inside a spreadsheet, the dollar that walked off when nobody was looking. People assume that makes me cold. Daniel used to say it just made me honest. We'd been married 12 years, together a little longer, in a small brick house on Linden Street here in Hartwell, North Carolina. He was the careful one. I balanced other people's books. He balanced ours, quietly, the way some men fix a fence before you ever notice it's leaning. My family never noticed Daniel much. The Everetts were close in the way a fist is close, tight, but only around themselves. My mother, Coralie, ran the family like a church committee. My brother Bryce was the son everyone orbited. And me, I was the one who showed up. Flat tire at midnight, overdraft before payday, a roof that needed money nobody had. That was my phone ringing. I never minded. You don't mind when you love people. I should have counted how many of them ever called just to ask how I was. The number would have told me something. Daniel knew the number. He never said it out loud, but he started saying other things near the end. Small things. He'd squeeze my hand and tell me to be careful with people who only remembered me when something broke. I thought it was the medication talking. I'd kiss his forehead and change the subject, because the subject was unbearable, and there was always a chart to read or a pill to crush or a window to open. I didn't understand how careful he'd actually been until it was far too late to thank him. The cancer took 18 months to take Daniel. Pancreatic, stage 3 when they found it. And you learn fast that those numbers don't bend for anybody. I cut my client hours in half. I learned to flush a port, to read a morphine chart, to sleep upright in a chair without falling out of it. My family learned none of it. Coralie called maybe twice a month, and never about him. She'd ask whether I'd seen Bryce's new truck, whether I was coming to Easter, whether I'd talked to the pastor lately. Daniel would be 3 feet away, gray and shrinking, and she'd ask about the pastor. One night I had her on speaker while I changed his sheets. She didn't know I could hear her tell my Aunt Sherry, low and certain, "We're your real family, Willa, not his." Daniel heard it too. He just closed his eyes and pretended he hadn't, because that was kinder than letting me watch his face. That was the spring he started having appointments he went to alone. He'd say they were follow-ups, scans, the usual. He'd come home tired and a little far away, a cream-colored envelope sometimes riding on the passenger seat. I asked him once if everything was okay. He smiled and said he was just putting things in order, and a dying man putting things in order is the most normal sentence in the world. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? You don't audit the person you're losing. You hold his hand and you pray the math is wrong. Daniel died on a Tuesday morning, with my hand on his chest and the radio low. The funeral home set the service for Saturday at 2. I called my mother first, the way you do. I expected grief, maybe, a casserole. Instead, Coralie got very quiet, then very practical. "Saturday's Bryce's party, sweetheart," she said. "His 40th. We've had the hall booked for months." I said I was burying my husband. She said she understood. She truly did. And was there any way the funeral home could do Sunday, or maybe the following weekend, so the family wouldn't have to choose? I stood in my kitchen on Linden Street and felt the floor tilt. Choose. Bryce got on the line. All easy warmth, the voice that had talked our parents out of consequences his whole life. "Don't make this a thing, Will," he said. "He's gone. He won't know who shows up." I told him I wasn't moving Daniel's funeral around a balloon order. I said it calmly. I'm always calm. It's the only weapon I've ever trusted. There was a pause, the kind where people recalculate. Then Coralie sighed, like I was the difficult one, like grief was a scheduling conflict I was being rude about. "We'll see what we can do," she said, which in Everett means no. I hung up and looked at the calendar on the fridge, at the little square that said Bryce's 40th in my mother's looping handwriting, and I understood that a decision had already been made in a room I wasn't standing in. The texts trickled in over the next 2 days, and I watched my family RSVP to a birthday over a burial in real time. Aunt Sherry was so sorry, but she'd promised to help with the cake. My uncle had a thing with his knee. 2 cousins were driving Bryce's gift up from Charlotte and just couldn't swing both. Nobody said no to the funeral outright. That's not how the Everetts work. They simply found themselves unavoidably elsewhere, all of them, on the same afternoon, by what my mother would later call a sad coincidence. I found the family group chat open on my own phone one night, I was still in it then, and saw the planning underneath the apologies. Coralie, coordinating. "What time's the toast? Who's bringing the tablecloths?" One line from her, sent at 9:40 the night before I buried my husband. "Let's keep it light for Bryce. Nobody wants a sad day." Nobody. I read it 3 times. I'm trained to read documents for what they're actually saying, and that one said everything. By the morning of the service, my phone had gone very, very quiet. No good luck text. No, "Are you okay?" Just a weather alert and a reminder that my prescription was ready. I dressed in the dark so I wouldn't have to see my own face in the mirror. Then I drove to the funeral home alone, in a black dress Daniel had never seen, to bury the only person in my life who'd ever asked how I was, and waited for the whole answer. The chapel at Hartwell Memorial seats 120. I counted the empty rows, because counting is what I do when the alternative is screaming. There'd been an old truck I half knew parked nose out at the far back of the lot when I pulled in, but I was too hollow to place it, and I didn't look twice. 3 people came. Daniel's hospice nurse, Marion Cole, in her good coat, sitting straight as a fence post. Robin Hale, Daniel's friend since college, who'd flown in from Ohio on 4 hours of sleep, and me. The funeral home had set out a guest book on a little brass stand by the door, cream pages, a pen on a chain. By the time the service ended, there were 3 lines of writing in it, 3 names on a page built for hundreds. I remember staring at all that white space and thinking it looked like an accusation. The minister, who'd never met Daniel, called him a beloved member of the community, and I didn't correct him, because somewhere across town a hall full of my relatives was proving exactly how beloved a man had to be to get a Saturday afternoon. Marion found me afterward at the casket. She put her hand on my arm, this small woman who'd held a stranger's husband through his worst nights, and she said, "He talked about you until the very end, you know. Right up to the last day." I didn't cry then. I'd done my crying in chairs at 3 in the morning for a year and a half. I just nodded and took the guest book off the brass stand and slid it into my bag, because it was the only record that anyone at all had come, and some stubborn instinct told me I'd want it later. I didn't know yet how right that instinct would turn out to be. That night, I made tea I didn't drink and opened my phone, the way you do when the house is too quiet and the bed is too big. Bryce had posted the party. 41 photos. There was the banner, gold foil, 40, and fabulous. There was the cake. 3 tiers. A sparkler fountain throwing light. There was my whole family crowded behind it, mid-laugh, my mother in the center with a glass raised and her head thrown back. They looked wonderful. They looked like a commercial for the kind of family I thought I had. I scrolled, numb, until I reached the photo of the toast, and then the accountant in me did the thing it always does. I looked at the timestamp, 2:14 p.m. I knew that number. I'd watched it tick over on the little brass clock above the casket as 4 men I'd hired lowered my husband into the ground. 2:14. While my mother lifted her glass, I was watching dirt. I didn't cry at the photo. I screenshotted it. Old habit. When something doesn't add up, you preserve the original before anyone can edit it. I saved the image and the timestamp with it, and I set the phone face down on the nightstand. I told myself it didn't matter, that knowing the exact minute changed nothing. But numbers are stubborn that way. Once you've seen them, you can't unsee them. And 2:14 moved into my house that night like a tenant who would never once be paying rent. In the weeks after, the house filled up with the paperwork of a life ended too soon. Daniel had left it all in order, the way he'd promised, folders labeled in his blocky handwriting, accounts listed, passwords in a sealed sleeve. He'd made dying as easy on me as a thing like that can be. I wasn't ready to open most of it. But one folder was thicker than the rest, and on the tab he'd written a single word. House. Not our house. I stood there holding it and remembered something I'd spent years not thinking about. 8 years back, my parents had nearly lost their place out on Route 9. Second mortgage, a balloon payment, the whole grim arithmetic of people who'd never once balanced a checkbook. And then, somehow, the crisis just evaporated. Nobody explained how. I'd asked Bryce about it once, years later, and he'd waved it off with that lazy confidence of his. Don't worry about the house money, he'd said. That loan dies with him. Him. Not it. At the time I'd thought he meant our father, that Roy had quietly taken something on. Standing in my hallway with Daniel's folder in my hands, I started to understand I'd had the wrong him the entire time. I didn't open it that night. I set it on the kitchen table where Daniel used to do our taxes, and I left it there, squared to the edge. Everyone in my family assumed the math had died with Daniel. But math doesn't die. It just waits, very patiently, for someone to open the file. My family rediscovered me about 9 days after the funeral, which is roughly how long it takes for curiosity to outrun shame. Coralie called, and her voice had gone soft and rich, the tone she saved for fundraising. She said she'd been giving me space. She said grief was sacred and she hadn't wanted to crowd me. Then, in the same breath, smooth as a turn signal, she asked how I was holding up, with all of Daniel's affairs. Affairs. Such a careful word. Bryce texted that same afternoon, the first time since the party. Hey Will, thinking of you, we should grab coffee. My aunt mailed a card. The Everetts, who couldn't spare a Saturday for a casket, suddenly had nothing but time for a widow. It's a remarkable thing, how fast people find an opening in their calendar when money's involved. Coralie got to the point the way she always did, by pretending she wasn't. Did Daniel leave any instructions, sweetheart? About the house, the family things? She asked. We're still family. Family shares. I told her I was still sorting through it, which was true, and that I'd let everyone know, which was also true, just not in the way she was imagining. I hung up and looked at the house folder on the kitchen table, still squared to the edge, still unopened. Then I picked the phone back up and called the one number on Daniel's list I hadn't dialed yet. A law office. Those cream-colored envelopes had come from somewhere. If you've ever watched people who couldn't spare one afternoon suddenly find all the time in the world when money's involved, you already know where this goes. Stick with me. I'm going to show you exactly what I did and exactly what the law let me do. Hit subscribe so the next part finds you. The story reached me before I reached the lawyer, because in a town the size of Hartwell, gossip travels faster than grief. Aunt Sherry had been busy. The version going around the church social hour was that poor Coralie had lost her daughter years ago, not to death, but to that husband, the one who'd filled my head with ideas about boundaries and turned me cold against my own blood. People I'd known since Sunday school looked at me in the food line with a soft, terrible pity, the pity you save for someone who's been brainwashed. Daniel, the man who'd put out my mother's financial fire without ever asking for thanks, was being recast as the villain who'd stolen me. I didn't fight it. That's the thing my family never understood about me. You can't argue a person out of a story they enjoy telling. So I went quiet. I let them talk. And while they talked, I did the only thing I've ever been truly good at. I gathered the paper. I pulled every folder Daniel had labeled. I made copies. I built a timeline, dates in a column, the way I would for any case where someone is lying and the truth is hiding in the records. On top of the house folder sat that cream-colored envelope, the one that matched the ones from his solo appointments, still unopened, addressed in a careful hand. Tasso and Reed, attorneys at law, Hartwell. I'd been afraid to open it. Grief makes cowards of careful people. But gossip has a way of curing fear. The next morning, I called the office, and the woman who answered said Mr. Whitfield had told them I might. Gwen Tasso's office smelled like old paper and good coffee, and she had the kind of steady face that doesn't flinch at anybody's worst day. She'd known Daniel for 2 years, it turned out. He'd come to her the spring his scans turned bad, alone, on those afternoons I thought were follow-ups. He wanted things clean for you, she said. He didn't want you doing this part while you were still doing the other part. My throat did something complicated. She walked me through it slowly, in plain numbers, which I appreciated more than she could know. Daniel's estate, the life insurance, his share of the consulting firm he'd helped build, the brokerage account he'd grown in patient silence over 12 years, came to a little over $1.8 million. All of it left to me. Clean, through a will and a living trust, no probate fight, no ambiguity. He'd named me executor of the will and trustee of the trust, both, so there was nobody to settle his affairs through but me. I sat with that. I'd known Daniel was careful. I had not known he was that careful, that the quiet man who clipped coupons had been building me a floor to stand on the entire time. I started to thank her, to stand, to take my folder and go home and grieve a man I apparently hadn't fully met. Gwen didn't stand. She folded her hands on the desk and looked at me the way you look at someone right before you hand them something heavy. "There's one more thing, Willa," she said. "There's a note, and I think you'd better sit back down for this one." The note was 8 years old, 40-some pages, signed in 3 places, recorded down at the county courthouse where these things become real. When my parents nearly lost the house on Route 9, the bank wouldn't budge, and Bryce had nothing, and my father had less. So Daniel had stepped in, quietly, the way he did everything. He'd written a check that covered the arrears and the balloon and the lawyer's fees. $400,000, near enough, and he'd done it the right way, the careful way, the only way a forensic accountant's husband would ever do it. Not a gift. A loan. A promissory note, secured by a deed of trust against the house itself, with my parents' signatures on every page. They'd kept their home because of him, and they'd told themselves, and the whole family, that it was just family helping family, the kind of thing that dissolves the second the helper dies. Daniel never forgave the balance, Gwen said. It's still owed. As of his death, that note isn't his anymore. It's an asset of his estate. And Daniel named you executor, and his only beneficiary. You administer the estate, and whatever it collects, in the end, it collects for you. For me, I read the deed twice, then a third time, my hands very steady, because steadiness is what I have instead of falling apart. So the loan didn't die, I said. It just changed owners. Gwen nodded, slow. It changed owners, she said. Somewhere across town, my brother was telling people the house money died with Daniel. The 40-page document in front of me, signed and stamped and recorded, said otherwise. Only one of us had it in writing. I took copies and drove home with the note on the passenger seat, right where Daniel used to set those cream envelopes. Over the next few days, the family's assumptions reached me secondhand, the way everything did. Bryce, it seemed, had plans. He'd run his mouth at the party I now knew the exact minute of, about how things were finally going to ease up. A cousin let it slip, not unkindly, just gossiping. Bryce was underwater. 2 trucks, a boat, a kitchen renovation he'd financed on pure optimism, and a private lender in Charlotte who was no longer charmed by him. And my mother's golden boy had a plan to fix all of it. He was going to lean on me, on Daniel's money, on what he called, to anyone who'd listen, the family's share. When the cousin asked whether that was really Bryce's to count on, he laughed. "Relax," he said. "That loan dies with him. It always was a gift." A gift. I sat with that word a long time. I knew exactly what the document called it, because I'd read it 3 times with my own eyes. Bryce called it a gift. The deed of trust called it collateral. One of those words was just a story my brother liked telling. The other one was signed, witnessed, and recorded at the county courthouse on the 8th of March, 8 years ago. In my experience, when a story and a signature disagree, the signature wins. It just takes a while for everybody else to find out. Gwen had given me one more thing that first day, and I'd been too raw to read it. A letter. Not in some keepsake box. Daniel knew I'd never been sentimental about objects. Just 3 pages in his blocky hand, tucked in the front of the house folder where he knew I'd eventually look. I finally read it at the kitchen table, under the light where he used to do our taxes. He'd written it the spring of the bad scans, clear-headed, no self-pity, the most Daniel thing I have ever held in my 2 hands. He told me he'd watched my family use me for 20 years and call it love. He listed it, gently, like line items, the loans I'd quietly covered, the holidays I'd hosted and paid for, the way Bryce's emergencies always somehow became mine. He said he'd never told me what to do about any of it, because it wasn't his to decide. Then he wrote the thing I keep folded in my wallet to this day. "I'm not asking you for revenge, Willa. I left the note unforgiven on purpose, and I left the choice to you. Be kind, you always are, but stop paying for people who won't stand up for you. You're allowed to keep what you've earned." I read it maybe 10 times. He hadn't built a trap. That's the part that undid me. He hadn't rigged anything, hadn't written some clever clause that would spring shut on my family the second they crossed a line. He'd simply declined to erase a debt, handed me the deed, and trusted me to be an adult about it. The trap, if there was one, was the one my family had been building for themselves, brick by brick. Every single time they assumed I'd absorb the cost of being treated like I didn't matter. Daniel had just stopped paying their bill before he died. Now the bill had my name on it, and a choice, and a letter that ended on the word earned. There was a smaller cruelty buried in the file, and Gwen walked me through it on my second visit. For years, my parents had bragged, quietly, the way Everett's brag, by mentioning it to everyone, that Daniel's life insurance named them. 400,000, they'd say, when Daniel passes. God forbid. They'd counted on it the way some people count on the lottery, as a future fact. And it was almost true. Daniel had named them once, early on, back when he still believed they might earn it. They were beneficiaries. Contingent beneficiaries. Backups, Gwen said, when she saw I already understood. A contingent beneficiary only collects if the primary one is gone. You're the primary, Willa. You are very much alive. So the 400,000 my parents had spent in their imaginations a dozen times over had never, for one single second, actually been theirs. It would only have reached them if I had died first. As long as I was breathing, the policy paid me, and the backups stayed exactly that. Backups who never get called off the bench. They didn't know. That was the part that sat strangest with me. They'd been so sure, so casually entitled to a number they'd never once read the paperwork on. I think about that a lot now. How much of what my family believed they were owed was just a story nobody had ever bothered to check. I'm a person who checks. It's the whole job. And every figure I checked told me the same quiet thing. They were never getting a cent that Daniel hadn't decided, on paper, to give them. I want to be honest about something, because this is the part people skip when they tell these stories. I almost forgave it. All of it. For about a week I drafted a different version of myself in my head. The bigger person, the one who lets it go, signs a release, forgives the 400,000, and keeps what's left of a family because family is supposed to be worth more than money. I even told Gwen I was leaning that way. She didn't argue. She just said, "It's yours to forgive. Make sure you're forgiving them, not training them. That sentence followed me home. One night I opened the party photos again, the way you press on a bruise. I zoomed in this time, slow, face by face, the forensic habit I can't switch off. My mother, glass up, radiant. Bryce, mid-laugh, already spending money that was never his. Aunt Sherry, the cousins. And there, at the back edge of the frame, half in shadow, my father, Roy. Everyone in that picture was beaming except him. He stood a little apart, hands at his sides, looking at the cake like a man at the wrong funeral. I stared at that for a long time. Then I looked at the timestamp again, the one I couldn't unsee. 2:14 p.m. While I lowered Daniel into the ground, my whole family was raising a glass, and the only one of them with the decency not to enjoy it still hadn't found the spine to drive 20 minutes and stand beside me. I closed the laptop. I'd stopped drafting the forgiving version of myself. Some debts, it turns out, you collect for the record. The pressure changed key once they sensed I wasn't folding. Soft turned sharp. Coralie called crying now, real-sounding tears, the kind she could summon for a church fundraiser. I don't understand what's gotten into you, she sobbed. Are you going to put your own parents out on the street? Over money? Daniel's barely cold. Daniel's barely cold, from the woman who'd toasted at 2:14. I held the phone away from my ear and looked at the note on my table and reminded myself what was true. Mom, I said, and I kept my voice level. I haven't done anything yet. I'm reading what Daniel actually signed. That's all. That wasn't enough for her, of course. Nothing short of total surrender ever was. She brought in reinforcements, Aunt Sherry calling to say I was tearing the family apart, an uncle leaving a voicemail about honoring thy father and mother, a cousin texting a paragraph about how Bryce was really stressed right now and didn't need this. Not one of them asked how I was. Not one of them mentioned Daniel except as a balance owed. They'd skipped his funeral to protect a party, and now they were circling me to protect a debt. And they genuinely could not see the line connecting those two things. But I could. I'm a person who connects things, it's the job. So I made one more appointment with Gwen. She asked what I wanted to do. I told her I wanted to send something. Polite, official, on letterhead. The kind of thing that doesn't raise its voice, because it doesn't have to. Bryce showed up on my porch on a Thursday, uninvited, with the easy grin that had gotten him out of trouble for 40 years. He drove the 25 minutes from our parents' place and let himself sit at my kitchen table like he paid the mortgage on it, eyes already cataloging the house, the appliances, Daniel's good watch on the counter. He started warm. Family, grief, healing, all the right words. Then he slid to it. He needed a bridge, just temporary. Just till he got things sorted. The lender in Charlotte was getting unfriendly. I told him it was coming, Bryce said. And there it was. He'd promised a man in Charlotte a payout from my husband's estate before my husband was even in the ground. He'd borrowed against my grief. When I didn't jump up to write a check, the grin cooled. Come on, Will, he said, and the real Bryce stepped through. You married into money. The least you can do is share it back. It's family money. Daniel would have wanted the family taken care of. I asked him quietly which family he meant. The one that came to the funeral, or the one that came to the party. He didn't have an answer for that, so he did what he always did when cornered. He got loud. He said I'd changed, that Daniel had ruined me, that Mom was right about me all along. Then he left, slamming my screen door so hard it bounced twice. I sat there a while in the quiet. I just watched my brother try to collect on a man he couldn't be bothered to bury. Whatever was left in me that wanted to be the bigger person finished dying right about then. I picked up the phone, called Gwen, and told her to send the letters. Gwen drafted it the way I asked. No heat, no insult. Nothing a person could screenshot and cry over. Just facts, the kind that don't flinch. Per the estate of Daniel Whitfield, the promissory note dated the 8th of March, secured by deed of trust against the property on Route 9, principal balance $400,000, was now due and payable to the estate. The letter laid out 3 civilized paths, They could repay the balance. They could refinance and pay the estate out. Or they could sell the house and settle from the proceeds. Reasonable terms, a real timeline, my attorney's number for any questions. It was, I made very sure, the gentlest version of a hard truth that exists. Gwen printed 5 copies, one for each address, and slid them into envelopes. And I noticed the paper. Cream. Heavy stock. A faint laid texture. The exact envelopes Daniel used to bring home from these very offices on the afternoons I thought were scans. The paper that had ridden quietly on his passenger seat for a year was about to ride out to my family with my name behind it instead of his. I held one for a second before it was sealed. There's a strange symmetry to how a thing comes back around. Daniel had spent his last private months in this office, on this paper, building me a way out that never once required me to raise my voice. All I had to do was let the envelopes do the talking. I gave Gwen the addresses from memory. I'd grown up at one of them. I'd nearly watched it sell at auction once too, except it was never really mine to lose. It was Daniel's, on paper, the whole time. People love to say money can't buy back time. True, but it can buy back a house. The one my parents only kept because Daniel signed for it. If you've ever been the family member who quietly carried everyone, you're going to want to see what happens next. Comment, receipts kept, and let's keep going. The letters landed on a Saturday, 2 weeks to the day after they'd chosen cake over a casket. I know the timing because my phone told me, loudly, all afternoon. It started with Bryce, a string of texts that went from confused to furious in under a minute. What is this? Is this a joke? Call me now. Then the cousins, then Aunt Sherry, who had a great deal to say about Christian charity, for a woman who'd helped plan the cake. And then my mother, who didn't text. My mother called. 9 times. I let it ring, all 9, and watched her name light up the screen and go dark, light up and go dark, like a porch lamp shorting out. I learned later from the one cousin who still spoke to me plainly how it had gone at the house on Route 9. Coralie had opened her envelope at the kitchen table, read the first line, per the estate of Daniel Whitfield, and gone white. The cousin said her hands shook so badly she had to lay the page flat on the table to finish reading it. The man they'd buried in gossip and skipped in life had reached across his own grave with 1 calm paragraph and 40 pages of signatures, and there was nothing in their whole repertoire of tears and stories that could argue with a recorded deed. On the 10th call, I finally picked up. Before she could get a word out, I said the only sentence I had left for her. Talk to my lawyer, Mom. Then I hung up, set the phone face down, and made myself a real cup of tea. I drank this one. They regrouped fast, the way people do when the soft approach fails and they need a room. Coralie's next move arrived through my aunt, because my mother had decided, with the wounded dignity of a queen, that she would not beg. There was to be a family dinner. Sunday, at the house, to clear the air and put this awful business behind us. A reconciliation, Sherry called it, in a tone that made plain reconciliation meant me tearing up the letters over pot roast. Your family, Willa, she said. We don't do lawyers. We sit down and we work it out like family. You're tearing this whole family apart over paperwork. Paperwork. 40 pages that had saved their house, reduced to paperwork. I almost laughed. I knew exactly what Sunday was. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was a venue. They were going to fill that dining room with relatives. Sherry, the cousins, probably the uncle with the opinions. Maybe whatever neighbor my mother could rope in as a witness to my cruelty. The plan was old and obvious. Surround the difficult woman with enough faces and enough pot roast and enough talk of blood, and she'll soften, she'll cave, she'll do what she always does, and absorb the cost so everyone can be comfortable again. They were counting on the old Willa, the one who showed up, who fixed it, who paid. I understood the trap completely, so I did the thing that surprised even me. I said yes. I told Sherry I'd be there at 6. Then I hung up and went and made a folder. I spent Saturday night the way I'd spend any case the night before it mattered. At the kitchen table, under Daniel's light, I built the file. Not to ambush anyone, I want to be clear about that, because it would have been easy to make it a weapon, and I didn't. I built it so that when the room got loud, I wouldn't have to. A clean copy of the promissory note. The recorded deed of trust. Courthouse stamp and all. A one-page timeline. Because a timeline is what the truth looks like when you take the emotion out. Diagnosis: the date Daniel signed the note 8 years prior, the date he died, the date of the funeral, the date of the party, the same date, and the date the letters went out. And 2 things that weren't legal documents at all. The screenshot, 2:14 p.m. glowing in the corner, and the guest book, the one I'd taken off the brass stand, 3 signatures on a page meant for hundreds. I opened it again to add it to the stack, and I noticed something I'd missed in the fog of that day. Beside her own name, in small, careful nurse's handwriting, Marion had written 4 words. He was not alone. I sat with that a while. He was not alone, because 3 people on this earth had understood that showing up is the whole of love, and none of them shared my last name. I closed the book and laid it on top of the folder. Gentle. The way you close a door on a sleeping house. I wasn't bringing anger to dinner. Anger you can dismiss. I was bringing a folder. You can't cry your way out of a folder. I drove the 25 minutes out to Route 9 on Sunday with the folder on the passenger seat, in the spot that had held Daniel's envelopes, and then the note, and now this. The house looked the same as it had my whole childhood. The porch Daniel had paid to keep over their heads, though they'd never once said it that way. There were more cars than I expected. Sherry's sedan, the cousins' trucks, a neighbor's old Buick, a venue, just like I'd thought. Inside, the air was thick with pot roast and performance. My mother met me at the door with a hug that didn't quite touch me, all collarbone and cold cheek, murmuring how glad she was that I'd come, how we were going to fix everything tonight. Bryce stood by the window with his arms crossed, not drinking, jaw tight, a man waiting to be handed something he'd already decided was his. Aunt Sherry arranged her face into sympathy. And my father, Roy, stood at the edge of the kitchen the way he'd stood at the edge of that party photo, looking at the floor, finding somewhere else to be every time my eyes moved toward him. They'd set the table for 9. There was a place for me. The good plates out. My name practically painted on the chair. First time in years they'd set a place for me. I stood in the doorway holding my folder and understood, finally and completely, why. Coralie waited until the plates were full, because she'd always understood that people are easiest to manage with their mouths busy. Then she tapped her glass, soft, and made her speech. She talked about family like it was a country she'd founded. She talked about Daniel, generously now, fondly, a good man, gone too soon, God rest him, the same man she hadn't crossed town to bury. She talked about how grief makes us do rash things, how lawyers only ever make a wound deeper, how the Everetts had always handled their own. And then, smooth as ever, she landed it. So we're all agreed, I think, that this letter business was a mistake made in pain. Willa's going to call that attorney Monday and put a stop to it, and we're going to be a family again. She smiled at me down the length of the table, and every face turned, the whole jury she'd assembled, waiting for the old Willa to nod. I set my fork down. I set my folder on the table beside my plate, squared to the edge the way Daniel used to square his. I didn't raise my voice. I never do. I hear you, Mom, I said. Can I ask everyone one thing first before I decide anything? The room, expecting surrender, said of course. Sweetheart, of course. They thought they'd already won. They'd just handed me the floor. I opened the folder and I didn't slide it across the table or wave it around. I just laid the deed where my mother could see the courthouse stamp. Bryce has been telling people the house money was a gift, I said, level as a ledger. That it died with Daniel. I want everyone to hear the truth, because you're about to make decisions based on a story, and the story is wrong. I touched the pages, one at a time. 8 years ago, when this house was 4 weeks from auction, Daniel paid $400,000 to save it. Not a gift. A loan. Signed by Mom and Dad, both of them, recorded at the county courthouse on the 8th of March. I read them the legal description of their own house off the deed of trust, lot, and parcel, the way you'd read a verdict. I watched it land. Daniel never forgave that balance, I said. He could have. He chose not to. And here is the part Bryce got wrong. I looked at my brother, who had gone the color of the tablecloth. You kept saying the loan died with him. It didn't. A debt does not die with the lender. It belongs to his estate. Then I said the sentence I'd driven 25 minutes to say, and I said it gently, which somehow made it worse. And I'm his executor, and his only heir. What that estate collects, I decide. For a moment nobody moved. You could hear the clock over the stove, the same one that had ticked through my whole childhood. The story they'd lived inside for 8 years. Family helps family. Debts dissolve. Willa absorbs the cost. Had just met a recorded deed, and the deed didn't blink. The old Willa would have softened it, would have rushed to reassure them. I let it sit there instead, true and heavy, and I quietly closed the folder. My mother detonated. It happened fast, the charm peeling off like wet paint, and suddenly she was on her feet with her napkin balled in her fist. How dare I? After everything she'd done for me, the sacrifices, the prayers, the labor of raising an ungrateful child, and this was her thanks, to be threatened with the street over money, with my husband barely in the ground. The tears came on command, fat and furious. You would do this to me? She cried to the room, to her jury. You'd put your own mother out on the street for a man who's already dead? The relatives shifted. This was the performance they'd come for. And here is where I want you to understand something about staying calm, because calm is not the same thing as weak. And my family had confused the two my entire life. I didn't rise. I didn't match her volume. I waited until the sob ran out of air, and then I answered the only way that was true. No, Mom, I said. I'm not putting you on the street. Daniel put a roof over your head 8 years ago. I'm just no longer paying for it. Bryce slammed his hand flat on the table, hard enough to jump the silverware. He called me cold. He called me a thief, which was a remarkable word from a man who'd promised a lender money that wasn't his. He told me I'd regret this, that I'd end up alone, that family is all anyone has at the end. I looked at him a long moment. I know exactly how alone I am, I said. 3 people came to find out. Nobody apologized. I want that on the record. In a room full of my own blood, with the truth laid out in signatures, not one of them said they were sorry. They just got louder. That's the tell, with people like mine. When the lie runs out, they don't reach for the truth. They reach for volume. When volume failed, my mother went for the oldest knife she owned. She drew herself up, wiped her eyes with the back of one hand, and aimed for the soft place she'd always been able to find. You'll see, she said, low and certain, the same voice she'd used over my dying husband. When all of this is over, when that man's money is spent, we'll still be here. We're your real family, Willa, not him. The room went quiet, because even they knew that one was meant to draw blood. And it would have. Once. The old Willa would have crumbled at real family, would have started apologizing, would have reached for the pen. Instead, I reached into the folder and took out the last thing in it. Not the deed. The guest book. I set it on the table and opened it to the only page with writing, and I turned it so the room could see all that white space and those 3 lonely names. Real family showed up, I said. 3 people did. A hospice nurse, his college roommate, and me. You were at a party. I touched Marion's small handwriting beside her name. He was not alone. Then I took out Daniel's letter and I read them one line, the line I keep in my wallet. He wrote, "Be kind, but stop paying for people who won't stand up for you." I let that settle. 12 years was real enough to save this house, I said. It's real enough to take it back. Last, I laid the screenshot face up in the center of the table where the pot roast was going cold, and I didn't say a single word about it. I didn't have to. They all leaned in and saw it. The toast, the raised glasses, and in the corner, In numbers none of them could argue with, 2:14 p.m. The exact minute they'd chosen. Nobody touched it. The clock over the stove kept ticking. And then, into all that silence, my father spoke. Roy hadn't said one word the entire night. He'd sat at the end of the table with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the grain of the wood, the way he'd stood at the edge of that photo, the way he'd stood at the edge of everything his whole life. Now he cleared his throat, and his voice came out cracked and old. "I went," he said. Everyone turned. That Saturday, I drove to the funeral home. I parked way out back, where you wouldn't spot the truck. I sat in the lot. He wouldn't look at me. I sat there an hour, Willa. Had my good jacket on. I just couldn't make myself walk in. Your mother was waiting on me at the hall, and He stopped. His chin was trembling. For 1 second something in my chest moved toward him, because here at last was a flicker of a conscience in a room that had shown none. He was human. I'll give him that much. But I had buried my husband in front of 3 people while my father sat 60 feet away in a parking lot with his good jacket on, close enough to hear the hymns. So I didn't hand him the absolution he was fishing for. "You had an hour, Dad," I said, and I kept it soft, because soft was sharper. "The doors were open the whole time. You just had to walk through them." He put his face in his hands. He didn't deny it. It was the most honest thing anyone in my family did all night, and it still wasn't enough, and we both knew it. I stood and I gathered my folder, and I left the guest book closed on the table a moment longer than I needed to. I told them the same 3 options the letter had given: repay, refinance, or sell and settle, and that Gwen would handle the timeline, and that I would not be discussing it again over dinner or anywhere else. My mother was crying for real now, the quiet kind that doesn't perform for anyone. Bryce had gone somewhere far behind his own eyes, already doing the math on a boat he'd have to sell. Sherry stared at her plate. I slid the screenshot back into the folder, but I left them the picture of it in their heads, because some things you can't unsee, and 2:14 belonged to them now too. At the door I turned. I wanted one clean sentence to carry out with me, and I found it. "My lawyer will be in touch," I said. Then, because I am my mother's daughter in exactly one way, I know how to land a closing line, I added. "Happy birthday again, Bryce." I drove the 25 minutes home with the folder on the passenger seat and the radio off. For the first time in 18 months, the quiet in that car felt like it belonged to me. They took 6 weeks to choose, which is about how long it takes pride to lose to a courthouse calendar. In the end, my parents refinanced. 8 years of a rising market had done what it tends to do out here. The house was worth nearly double what they'd borrowed against it, and the original mortgage was most of the way paid down. There was enough equity to pull $400,000 out and settle the estate in full, and so they did, signing at a title company across town in front of a notary I'd never met. They kept the roof. They just finally paid for it, which is all Daniel had ever quietly asked. Bryce did not fare so gently. With no family share coming, his lender in Charlotte stopped being patient. The boat went first, then one of the trucks. Then the half-done renovation got covered in plastic and abandoned. The story around the church social hour rearranged itself, the way stories do, and somehow I became the villain a little less, and Bryce became a cautionary tale a little more. I didn't help that along. I didn't need to. People can do arithmetic when the numbers get loud enough. One night, months later, I opened my phone to clear out old screenshots, and there it was. The party photo. 2:14 glowing in the corner. The image that had moved into my house like a tenant who never paid. I looked at it a moment. Then I deleted it. I didn't need it anymore. I'd already collected what it was for. I went no contact with my mother and with Bryce. Not out of rage, I was all out of rage, but the way you finally close an account that's only ever been overdrawn. Roy. I left a door open for, a narrow one. He hasn't walked through it yet, but he stopped sitting in parking lots, and that's something. The estate stayed mine, all 1.8 million of it, and I did the only thing with it that felt like Daniel. I set up a fund at the hospice, in his name, the kind that pays for nurses to sit through the night with people who'd otherwise be alone at 3 in the morning. Marion helped me design it. The guest book sits on the shelf in my front room now, beside the last good photo of Daniel, the two of them together. 3 names on a page built for hundreds. I used to think it looked like an accusation. Now I know what it actually was. A list. My real family. All of it. In 3 lines of ink. None of them share my last name. Every one of them showed up. Kindness was never my problem. I just finally stopped handing it to people who would skip my goodbye for a slice of cake. That's my story. 3 names in a guest book. 1 timestamp I'll never unsee, and a loan that didn't die with him. If it reminded you that quiet people keep the receipts, and that boundaries are allowed even with blood, take that as your sign. Update what needs updating. Tell someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.